Okay.
Always need to do it right away or I will forget. Um, cool. Welcome, Monica. It is right exactly 12 o'clock for me right now. So we will just get right in. I'm so thrilled to have Professor Richardson, Glenn Richardson, here with us. Wrote the book on the Field of Cloth of Gold. I interviewed you about 8 years ago, I think, 8, 9 years ago, something like that, for my podcast. You haven't aged a day. Neither have I. We both look much younger.
Quite right. Yes.
I wanted to just get in and get started asking you, kind of that we're going to talk about the Field of Cloth of Gold, obviously, like I said, but just some of the build up of setting the stage for the Field of Cloth of Gold and what led up to it, the move to diplomacy that Henry was seeing, and why changing from war to diplomacy.
Mhm. Right. Well, as I say in the book, the premise of the book is to explain what the Field of Cloth of Gold was, and without getting into detail now, it was basically a meeting to celebrate a peace treaty that had already been agreed 2 years earlier. Um, Now there were Henry and Wolsey were trying everything since Henry's accession to make him very prominent on the European stage. Unlike the British a few years ago, who decided to remove themselves, as it were, from politics in Europe with Brexit, in the 16th century, the English were very interested in being very much a part of the European political scene. However, England was a small country. Its resources couldn't match those of France and the German lands, called the Holy Roman Empire, and indeed the rising power of Spain. And Henry's first attempt at a war in 1512 and 13 had been reasonably successful, but had not really resulted in another Agincourt, like he hadn't conquered France like he'd intended to. He really was trying to renew the Hundred Years' War when he began. And so Wolsey, I think, came up with the idea that if you can't make magnificent war, which is what Henry wanted to do, then make peace magnificent. And the first time they do that is in 1514, after that first war, when Mary Tudor, Henry's sister, not his daughter, Henry's sister, marries Louis the XII of France, the only English woman ever to be Queen of France. She's not very long Queen of France because he dies a few months after they're married in October 1514, bringing the accession of Francis I, who becomes his great rival. Sorry if this is a bit detailed, but it really does help to understand the background.
Yeah.
Francis, of course, has got very strong sense of his chivalric kingship, just like Henry does, and without going into all the details, he conquers the Duchy of Milan and Lombardy in northern Italy within sort of 9 months of his accession in 1515. And between then and 1518, there's really nothing Henry's able to do. He can't really organize any effective action against Francis that will give him an excuse to go to war. And Wolsey comes back again with this idea of magnificent peace. And that is also to do with the other great power of the time, probably the greatest power of the time, of course, the rise of the Ottomans, and their expansion into the Middle East, into Egypt, Syria, etc., and eventually into North Africa under Suleiman. And Pope Leo X is very concerned about this. He wants to stop Christian leaders fighting each other and start fighting the Turks instead. And Wolsey seizes on that. And instead of agreeing to just a peace between himself, Francis, Charles, who's the King of Spain, and everybody else, Wolsey suggests, why don't we have, it's very topical at the moment, why don't we have a kind of the equivalent of NATO? Um, a kind of collective security where we all collectively organize and pay for our own security. And That's kind of what the Treaty of Universal Peace of 1518 is. Now, to make something like that appealing, it's got to have a big setup. So that's the treaty which was signed in London in October 1518. And Henry and Francis were due to meet as allies. So not only did they agree to peace, but they agreed to become allies and champions of international peace. And that's what the Field of Cloth of Gold is meant to be, a tournament to celebrate the alliance and the international peace. Unfortunately, the Emperor Maximilian dies in 1519, January 1519, and it takes 6 months for him to be replaced, as it were, with his successor, Charles of Habsburg, his grandson, who becomes the Emperor Charles V. So that brings us really to the reasons why the cloth of gold is postponed from 1519 to 1520. Um,
Gotcha.
you'll have to edit that, I'm sure, but that gives you the whys and wherefores of how we got to 1520.
I'm a little bit blown away by these treaties that Wolsey was able to negotiate, especially the one that I've heard it referred to as like Henry would be the referee if there were issues. Like, who agreed? Why would people agree to that? And can you give me a little bit of how Wolsey was able to get that in there? And also, this is probably a separate question, but Wolsey's goals at this time, was this when he thought he might still be Pope, or what was happening like in Wolsey's life, and how was he positioning himself here? So those are two separate questions, I suppose, but we can do
Okay.
them one.
Well, the first one is about, yes, the idea was that originally the Pope would arbitrate between princes and to resolve any conflicts that were preventing the universal peace of Christendom, as they called it. And Wolsey sort of thought, well, Pope Leo X is he's a Medici. He's as Pope, he's got all his status, but as an actual noble prince, he's not got a lot of pull really. A king of England, and a king who has, as Wolsey would see it, made war against France, but is really a great champion of the church, and this will become important later, of course. Is a much better person. He's a man who knows what it's like to go to war and to have to make peace, which after all he's just done. He showed us all how it's done in 1514, so Wolsey will say. And so I think everybody, Erasmus and other people are talking about peace and how it's important. And it's not that dissimilar these days, is it? Everybody wants peace. Everybody's happy to sign up to a coalition of the willing,
Right.
try to bring about peace. We all want peace, but on what terms? And I think Wolsey gets enough enthusiasm going, supported by Leo, who's sort of a bit overtaken in all of this. He turns it into a chivalric quest kind of thing, which young kings like Henry, like Francis, like Charles can to some extent sign up to. And don't forget that, if two of them plus Venice gets involved because Venice has got all kinds of things it wants to be doing. Once you get two, three, four major powers signing up to this, suddenly everybody wants to be part of it for fear of being not part of it because they don't really know where this is going, but at least we can sign up to it.
Right, right.
So that I think is, and whether people ever thought that Henry would actually arbitrate, probably they didn't think about it at the time. But of course, that is exactly what he's asked to do a few years later. But we'll maybe come back to that. But as to Wolsey, I think what's good for Henry is good for Wolsey. That's always his watchword. It worked in 1514, didn't it? Henry agreed to peace and got a huge annual pension from the French king. Also had his sister made Queen of France, so it's very, high status. And Henry's happy. Henry sees himself as being at the forefront of international politics. So I think Wolsey works. I think he thinks peace is a good thing. He does agree with Erasmus and Thomas More and people who are arguing that peace is between Christian princes and peoples is good. And so long as it's strategically all right for Henry, and it is at that point, it's also cheaper than war. And Wolsey is by now the Chancellor, uh, and the Chief Minister of Government is trying to keep tabs on Henry's expenditure. So there's all kinds of reasons why you can see Wolsey getting into it without wanting to be Pope. I don't myself believe Wolsey ever did want to be Pope, except when there was a rumor in 1527 that Clement VII had died. And in those very particular circumstances of 1527, when he's trying to get the annulment of Henry's marriage, yes, I think he did want to be Pope then, but I don't think he sets out. I don't think there's any evidence really that he ever set out to try to become the Pope.
Gotcha. Okay. And so that takes us to 1519, and there's a lot of preparations. Can you tell me a little bit about the preparations that are being made for the field? And just, this was a huge undertaking, and England didn't have a bridge or a tunnel. Tell me
No.
how they were able to get everything. Like how did this logistically work?
Yeah, well, without going down too much of a sidetrack, I've just written a new paper, a new article, on actually what the difference was between 1519. Remember, the thing is planned for 1519, and there's two memoranda that survive in the Society of Antiquaries in London. One seems to date from early 1519, when, the meeting is about 6 months away, which is, of course, later superseded by the death of the emperor and then the postponement of the meeting. But it's really interesting to see the two different documents. One's obviously the basis of the other. But for example, they were going to meet between Calais and Boulogne, and then Francis was going to come to Calais, and they were going to have the meeting at Calais in 1519. There's no talk in that first document of 6,000 people on either side. Queen Catherine and Queen Claude were going to be with their husbands at the first meeting. They were going to be introduced to each other, and it was a much more focused meeting. It turned out, well, than it turned out to be, and but then it's postponed. And what seems to happen is, with the extra time, the English decide to really, probably also with the election of Charles as emperor, the English really decide to go for it in a much bigger way. And so suddenly, forget Calais, it's too small, forget we'll have something in the field. We'll build an entire, not just a banqueting hall, which was going to be the case in Calais, to refurbish an existing banqueting hall. We'll build an entire new banqueting house. And I think it is the English who are really pushing this, as a way once more of advertising Henry's claims to be a monarch of continental European standard and standing. But to come to it is actually organized relatively shortly. So after all that planning, nothing happens for about 6 or 9 months, while the election is sort of had and Charles becomes emperor. So it's not until November 19 that they really start to think about things again.
Okay.
Henry builds a new royal yacht, as I've called it in the book, a new ship, the Catherine Plaisance, which is not a warship. It is like like a luxury yacht. You and your students will be far too young to have ever heard of the Royal Yacht Britannia, which Queen Elizabeth II, of happy memory, used to sail around in, the Duke of Edinburgh. That was scrapped by the Blair government in the 1990s.
They
Yeah,
featured that in the Crown. There was like a whole
that's
episode
right.
of
Yes,
that.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yes, the crying. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it was a bit like that, to sail across to Calais. As I said, they decide to build a huge temporary palace, which is as big as the biggest Oxford college, Christ Church, which of course is what Wolsey founds a few years after the Field of Cloth of Gold. It's very interesting that you can actually fit the measurements. We have the measurements of the palace, and it was a kind of square around a court, and you can literally just fit it inside the great court of Christ Church at Oxford. So Wolsey's, it's a kind of memory almost of the Field of Cloth of Gold there at Christ Church. And it really, when you stand there, it's the biggest quad in Oxford. And if you think, my God, they built that, something the size of this, for 2 weeks. They were really trying to impress. That's the biggest thing. So they have timber. It's partly prefabricated in England and sailed across the channel in bits, like a DIY, putting together.
Modular home or something like
That's
that.
right,
Yeah.
modular home, it's exactly. But the glass is real. It comes from the Netherlands, from Flanders and other places. It's got two floors. There's a great hall. There's dining chambers. It's all the walls are covered with tapestries and fabrics. There's rushes on the floor with lavender flowers and poppies, and it's called the Crystal Palace, and it's used for entertainments when the French court comes to visit the English camp, while also members of the English camp go to the French side. So that's the main thing. Then there's all the tents which they build, because the town which they built it next to is not Calais, but a much smaller place called Guisnes, which has a castle. So Henry can actually stay in the castle at night for security, but he can entertain his guests in this banqueting house during the day. There's also the tilt yard, of course, for the tournament, which is the main purpose of the event. And there's also all the ancillary accommodation for the court. So if you weren't lucky enough to be staying in the town of Guisnes, then you had to stay under canvas. But they replicated a Tudor manor house, so that for each of the great nobles and many of the gentry, there were, when I say a tent, they had what's really called a pavilion, which was composed of 4, 5, or 6 tents to replicate the main rooms in a Tudor manor house. So entry hall, dining chamber, bedrooms, etc. And
So it's more like glamping then, not so much camping.
Absolutely, very good word. Very, very, very glamping. And you had, like I said, about 5,000 to 6,000 people who were involved as guests on either side. The French do very similar things at the town of Ardres, which is just over the border in France, in what's called the Pas de Calais. So yeah, that takes, they put it all up very quickly. Francis's tents, etc., start to be made down at Tours, at the bottom of the Loire Valley. In February, I think it's February the 10th or something, he signs the orders to get work on that going. And everything's all ready for the end of May. It's all brought up from the Loire Valley on mules and pack horses, and then brought up to the French town of Ardres, all unpacked and built around the town. So you have these 2 towns on either side of the border, surrounded by like a mini towns of tents and open space between them, and in part of which is the tournament field. So they're ready to go by the end of May 1520.